Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our now working through each of the different poems of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now into Song of Myself, passage number 32, one of the best known single set of lines in all of Leaves of Grass, the I think I could turn and live with animals passage. Go ahead and put this in your notes right away. Without question, this is also some of the most radical lines. I'm going to help you to maybe try and understand why so many people, believe it or not, were more offended by this set of lines than they were by any of that kind of sexual autoerotica stuff that we were talking about in earlier sections 5 or 26, 27, 28 of Song of Myself. This is some pretty radical stuff. Whitman, the iconoclast. You'll remember we used that term in our introduction to Whitman. Yes, that is to say, he likes to pick up that large aluminum bat and walk up to ideas that are considered really holy and sacred and just bash them. The way, of course, Chaucer will have played the game in Canterbury Tales, as we talked about in earlier lectures at learnstrong.net. And, of course, the way Shakespeare, who we're going to reference here in a second, will play the game. Now, just to remind, we said that sections 26 through 38 of Song of Myself are in many ways kind of that poet's microscopic vision, moving from the ordinary to the mystical. And we said specifically sections 31 through 33 are in some ways a catalog of the infinite worlds that are contained in small things. Now, I think it's so important that we always come back to remind ourselves of that one line that comes from passage 4 of Song of Myself, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. Now that witness is going to be important here for our discussion. Now my assumption is you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt. I hope that you were with us for the 24 poems of inscriptions, that you were with us for the 19 sections of Promenade, and that for sure you've been with us for the previous 31 sections of Song of Myself. Let's go ahead now. Let's turn to the poem itself, and then after reading the poem, we'll try to answer why this was such a radical, radical poem for its day. I think I could turn and live with animals. They're so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. Not one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. Not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth. So they show their relations to me and I accept them. They bring me tokens of myself. They evince them plainly in their possession. I wonder where they get those tokens. Did I pass that way huge times ago and negligently drop them? Myself moving forward then and now and forever, gathering and showing more always and with velocity, infinite and ingenious, and the like of these among them. Not too exclusive toward the reachers of my remembrancers, picking out here one that I love and now go with him on brotherly terms. A gigantic beauty of a stallion, fresh and responsive to my caresses, head high in the forehead, wide between the ears, limbs glossy and supple, tail dusting the ground, eyes full of sparkling wickedness, ears finely cut, flexibly moving. His nostrils dilate as my heels embrace him. His well-built limbs tremble with pleasure as we race around and return. I but use you a minute, then I resign you, stallion. Why do I need your paces when I myself outgallop them, even as I stand or sit, passing faster than you? Now we'll begin with, and this is important because so many of my readers that I work with today obviously do not have the point of reference that an 1855 audience would have had, that would have understood the kind of allusions, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N-S, you might want to put this now at 2B, allusions or references to other texts. Now really, if one's going to appreciate the iconoclastic nature of this text, there's at least two passages which immediately have to come to mind. The first one, every reader in 1855 would have known that we are making somehow a reference to the book of Genesis in the King James Version of the Bible, chapter 1, starting at verse 24 through the end of the chapter. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And God said, behold, I've given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit, and of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat. And every beast of the earth, and every fowl of the air, and everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day, the conclusion of the first chapter of Genesis. Now, we've talked about Whitman's belief that he is creating a new religion, and of course his idea that he is reworking the Genesis 1 cosmogonic stories, that is to say creation stories. Here we're going to hear that in the King James Version of the Bible, that Whitman and his readers were quite familiar with, there was a clear distinction between humans and animals. And what is that distinction? Well, humans are more important, and they have dominion, to use the King James Version verse, over animals. Now, the other passage that I believe that Whitman is playing around with comes from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 4, and that famous soliloquy. We've given full lectures on this, but just to remind you here, how all occasions do inform against me, Hamlet says, and spur my dull revenge. And then he says it. He asks, what is a man, if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure he that made us hath with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fust in us unused. In other words, what is it, Hamlet asks, that's the difference between humans and beasts? In an answer, it is the ability to think. Words, words, words. Let's now turn to passage 32 and just see the incredibly iconoclastic nature of this passage. Notice he begins with, I think. We think of course, our Descartes with qui gocudo ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I think I could turn and live with animals. In other words, I think I would much rather prefer to live with animals than to live with humans. In other words, turning away from my human nature, I'd like to become an animal. Why? Well, notice, he says they're so placid and self-contained. They don't need anything. I stand, now again, I told you, you hear this, I stand, over and over in leaves of grass, and look at them long and long. By the way, in the original 55, it was sometimes half the day long, is the way he said it. Notice this looking at them long and long is almost as if a predator were watching something, right? Only now, he says, I'm going to study animals, and I'm going to look at animals, and I'm going to point out how animals are superior to humans. Not inferior, superior to humans. There's so much, he says, I think I could learn from just studying animals. Well, why? Notice Whitman's iconoclastic theology here, okay? In other words, what is wrong with most humans? He's going to tell us. They, animals, do not sweat and whine about their condition. Put that in your own words. What do you think he means by that? In other words, they don't sit around constantly worrying all the time. Anxious, anxious, worry, worry, worry. Of course, we are at 3A, going to join this to our study of Burns's To a Mouse, where, of course, Burns, the speaker of the poem, will say to the mouse, whose house he jacked, I'm really sorry I jacked your house, and I do realize that you and I are very similar. The best laid plans of mice and men soon off do go awry. But he says, I know I'm different from the mouse, because as soon as the mouse's house got jacked, it went on to build another house. Why? Because it doesn't have any sense of the past, as opposed to humans, who are always worrying about the future. Why? Well, because the only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. Think about that. I mean, you know. Flies don't wake up in the morning and go, gee, I wonder if today's the day the fly swatter jacks me. You know about fly swatters, though. And notice he says, the thing about animals is they don't whine. They don't sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark. Notice it is in the dark. And notice how he references the dark and night all the way through Leaves of Grass. And weep for their sins. In other words, they don't feel guilty about sin. Now, this is obviously an attack on Protestant Puritanism and the idea of always believing that one is worrying about one's sins and one's guilt. They do not make me, whoa, it gets actually kind of a little bit nasty here. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. By the way, of course, this would be a reference immediately to Immanuel Kant, right, in the idea of duty. Not one is dissatisfied. Now that's, of course, maybe an overstatement, because we've known any number of animals that seem dissatisfied when they're placed in situations they can't get out of, right? Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. Think about this. Marx's Communist Manifesto is 1848. We're reading 1855. The idea that Marx argues, of course, in Communist Manifesto, we've given full lectures on this elsewhere at learnstrong.net, is that humans are consumed in capitalist systems with this need to always constantly own things. Notice he calls it a mania, right? Insanity. He says not one, and now he is going to get nasty, not one kneels to another. Obviously, he's making references here to religious ceremonies where kneeling takes place, prayer and the like, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. In other words, this idea that we will worship and show genuflection to someone who lived thousands of years ago. The most self-evident, obvious answer to who he could be talking about is Christ himself, no question, right? Some 2,000 years previous in the history of the world. Not one is respectable, and almost when you read this, you have to put like rabbit ears around the word respectable, right? Not one is respectable, or unhappy is the deathbed edition. Industrious, in fact, is the original 1855 word, over the whole earth. Now, this is some radical stuff. What is Whitman actually saying here? Well, obviously he's talking about animals. But the obvious question is, how does he know that animals don't worry about any of those things? He's not really talking about animals, is he? He's talking about humans. And this is his critique of humans. Whitman is philosopher. His critique of humans. And what is it that he says about humans? Well, our biggest problem is that we're always worrying and anxious. And, of course, he's going to argue that our Puritanism has led us to this in 1855. So the animals show their relations to me and I accept them. In other words, I accept them as what they are. They bring me tokens of myself. It's an interesting word, this tokens of myself. They evince them plainly in their possession. Note the irony. He says they don't own anything, and yet he uses the word possession here. And then, showing his fallibilist epistemological position, he says, I wonder where they get those tokens. In other words, where did these elements that make them so remarkable come from? And then he asks an interesting evolutionary question. Did I pass that way huge times ago and negligently drop them? In other words, there was a moment in time, evolutionarily speaking, when he says, I myself was an animal, just like all of us, and yet now we're somehow quite different. We're not animals anymore. We're something quite different. We're these humans that have to live in guilt, in sin, in shame, in worry, in anxiety, the mania of owning things. Myself, he says, moving forward, then and now and forever, transcending and including. Again, this is very evolutionary view. Gathering and showing more always and with velocity, infinite and homogeneous, that is to say, of all kinds. This is his integral model. And the like of these among them, not too exclusive toward the reachers of my remembrances. In other words, I'm not going to hold as sacred to just one thing that comes from before. Picking out here one I love, and now go with him on brotherly terms. It's an interesting way to finish this. By the way, the original 55 said, picking out here one that shall be my ami, that French word for friend or lover, right? And then all of a sudden the poem shifts. It's quite fascinating. And we now move from animals to a stallion, to a horse, to a pony, right? A gigantic beauty of a stallion. Notice the quick descriptions that he will use. Responsive, fresh, and responsive to my, notice he calls it caresses, right? That is to say, when he's riding the pony, it's like caressing. And he'll use language that almost seems as if he's holding the animal with certain kind of respect. Head high in the forehead, white between the ears, limbs glossy and supple, tail dusting the ground, eyes full of sparkling wickedness. Now this will take us back, of course, in our study to starting from Pomenon, passage 7. Do you remember this when he says, I make the poem of evil also? I commemorate that part also. I am myself just as much evil as good, and my nation is, and I say there is in fact no evil, or if there is, I say it's just as important to you or to the land or to me as anything else. Radical lines in Pomenon. Obviously we're playing a similar kind of game here with this sparkling wickedness. Ears finely cut, flexibly moving, his nostrils dilate as my heels. Notice it's now from caress to embrace. Embrace him. His well-built limbs tremble with pleasure. It's interesting. It's almost like sexual language in some bizarre way. As we race around and return. I but use you. Now notice the shift. He's speaking now directly to the stallion. I but use you a minute. Notice the use of the word use, right? In other words, there seems to be a clear distinction. The stallion can't use Whitman. Whitman can use the stallion. Then I resign you, stallion. In other words, it's almost like he's apologizing. Why do I need your paces when I myself out-gallop them? In other words, I don't need an animal to be happy. Even as I stand, I told you this stand, right? We come back to it. We'll see it a lot, this formulation. Or I sit, passing faster than you. In other words, like animals, he comes to realize, I don't need anything. Well, it's finished quickly. Humans obviously need to live more simply, will be his argument, like the animals, live more naturally. Obviously, the allusions at 2b to the Bible and to Shakespeare, I think, are easy to find here. Notice the balance of the anaphoria. Did you see this? The 3 different times we will have that anaphoria, that repetition at the beginning. Notice, they do not, they do not, they do not, and then not one, not one, not one. Do you see that? So in other words, we're playing that. Notice how that gives that rhythm and that balance. At 3a, I've mentioned, obviously, the Bible and Shakespeare. Thoreau, I'd like to think from Walt and simplicity, simplicity. I'd also like to point out Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the land of the Houyhnhnms as well as the Yahoos. You'll remember where the horses run everything, and the Yahoos are the fallen degenerates, which are, of course, humans. And then we mentioned Burns's To a Mouse as well. Finally, at 3b, if you can own a passage like this, question, is it really, do you think, that simple to live like an animal? How about this for a question? Are we in fact born not human, but rather just mammalian? We're all mammals. We choose to be human, if we choose at all, and that's called our education. And that's what makes us somehow distinct from the stallion. What are your thoughts on that one? And finally, do you think there is any value in guilt and shame? In worrying about things? Do you think there's any point in all of that? And if so, what for you is that point? Well, from here now, we move on to passage 33, which is the great catalog section, one of the longer sections of Song of Myself. I hope that you're being challenged in your study here. Passage 32, Song of Myself. Thank you.